Hello everyone again, this is Mark White and Dennis Fernandez. We're talking to you from the offices of Whitespace, the business affiliate of our law firm, White, Summers, Caffey and James. Dennis, you and I have had two videos so far. This is video number 3. The first two talked about really intellectual property issues and the challenges that companies have on trying to invent the right thing by building towards converging points in technology and innovation. Second video was on really what companies have to look at to determine what standards are going to be created and what those convergent points are. In this video, I'd like to get a bit more pragmatic on talking about really the constant issues that earlier stage companies have to address, which is limited resources. You know, you want to patent the world if you can do that. There's always this concern about what is the true value of the venture? Is it technology? Is it revenue and market opportunity? Is it brand? But there's always this lag time on sort of creating value in a brand with a customer set that you don't have yet. Technology always comes up. And then there's this issue about what do investors value, and it kind of depends on the complexion of the organization. So there's a whole range of issues to talk about here, and I don't want to know about what patents are in the process. It's more, when should a company consider filing a patent as key to their business? Okay, so maybe address this first question, which is, how does a company know how important intellectual property is to what it is they're building? How do they know whether value is the technology itself, the solution, or it's the market that the solution addresses? Tough question. What are your thoughts?
Most entrepreneurs, when they draft the business plan, have a gut feeling on what the enabling technology is that give them a competitive advantage. It may be a set of innovations buried in a software, or it may be a few functional devices in a system. So in the early stage, it's usually not that hard for the founders to prioritize what these key enablers are. And those may be filed as one large patent application if they're related, or they'll chop it up into smaller modules. It gets more difficult later, once they're beyond the enabling technology. Because at that stage, now they're looking at incremental improvements, they're looking at blocking competitive activity. Often if there are other new employees who are contributing to the product and service, they're inventing other things. So you need some kind of committee to prioritize what is the next strategic IP, intellectual property that needs to be protected.
So you start with enabling technology, and that's core to at least the innovation piece of creating value in an enterprise. And do you file, so the question is this, do you file a utility patent up front, or do you file a provisional? You really don't know if your market's going to develop. You've got this time lag of a year after a project is launched to actually file. So if you're on a budget and you want to do it right, you want to protect your intellectual property, because that's going to be a block hopefully downstream, and there's some element of IP that has value creation for the enterprise. What's the knee-jerk reaction? You figure out your enabling technology and you file a provisional, which is inexpensive, and you just kind of leave that and then try to build the business launch, and then you worry about utility patent filings later on when you hit a deadline. What's the path here?
Well, ideally, if you have no budget constraints and you're comfortable with the drafting process because you've done other patent applications in the past, I would go straight to a normal utility non-provisional, because that launches the examination process sooner. But most startups are very resource constrained, and they need that extra year to raise money, or to shop their business plan, or to validate the market need. And so the reality, for example, in many software startups in Silicon Valley is they need to file a provisional, or a set of them, to have some credibility I think the downside risk, of course, is a lot of provisional quality are compromised if they're rushing it and they're very strict on budget, so they end up with a very thin specification that might get challenged in litigation later as invalid. So that's always the risk in doing the quick and dirty provisional approach. But if that's all you've got resources for in the beginning, it's better than nothing.
So let's go back to our earlier conversations. We talked about convergence, we talked about standards, now we're talking about enabling technology. It all is sort of the same thing, which is core to the innovation result solution itself. On the provisional, you talked about two ways to go. One provisional that captures the broad idea and maybe breaking it down. There's debate on both sides of that issue of what do you do? Have a large, really, description of the opportunity and the coverage that you want and the claims that you're making, or is it better from a prosecution standpoint later on and protectability standpoint with other competitors trying to follow what you're doing to break it down into pieces? What's your general thought on that?
That's a good question, Mark. I think what usually happens is people file what they have in the beginning. And if it's one big idea with a lot of pieces to it, they file that because they need to move on to recruiting and product launch and fundraising. And as they learn more innovations along the way, they file a stream of improvements to reinforce their portfolio of thinking. I think that's a good approach because it's realistic. I think what I would do is force a more strategic layer on top of that. Most startups are very focused purely on the engineering design that they're working on. And don't spend a lot of time extrapolating it into different vertical industries or competitive activity downstream. So there are some really interesting strategic hooks that can be inserted in these early filings that can be very valuable later in litigation or licensing. But they need to force themselves to rise above the implementation and think about the strategic hooks that will make the patent portfolio a lot more valuable.
So let's talk about strategic hooks. In my mind, there's probably two ways to conceptualize this. One is it's a hook that actually is the enabling core technology itself, because as you build your solution in iterations, you figure out what the hurdles are just by working on the solution that everyone else has to come across. Alternatively, it is just the way you build something and it's not the objective itself. So it's two different ways to look at it. Is it both of them in different respects, or they're different? You know, what is the strategic hook?
It's both.
Okay.
I've done it bottoms up, where you identify specific technical features that become widely adopted as an emerging best practice. I also look at it top down, where the industry is starting to converge on a platform that is a standard. These strategic hooks, from a patent attorney's perspective, have a lot to do with how you claim the invention as a novel apparatus or a novel method. So there's some legalese that empower the patent attorney to put these hooks into place to set up a licensing program later, or to force infringement as the industry is starting to clear up. For example, one of the interesting early industries right now is the Internet of Things. A lot of noise, a lot of experiments in trying different appliances. Some of it is wearable stuff, a lot of it has to do with low-cost sensors. And it's not clear today, you know, where that industry is heading, you know, with low-cost thermostats at home or things in the cars and wireless networks. But eventually, you'll have an opportunity to have some valuable patent portfolios if you have these strategic hooks in place early, and then you can tweak them later during the prosecution of your patent applications to align the hooks with licensable activity.
And if you ignore this, you're ignoring really what other competitors may be doing. So if you say technology is not that important, or the patentability of this is not as important to my device as it probably is, your competitors may be thinking differently. So you've got to be concerned about IP and strategy in building these hooks in. So I want to end this discussion with one question that has always been an issue for me trying to understand it. What we're talking about is you've got a core innovation. You're building iterations on top. So you're sort of folding on top as you build your solution. And it's not breaking a massive solution down into component parts. That's not the objective here. What happens, though, as you move in time and your core technology, for any reason, is invalidated? It's not protectable. It becomes property of someone else. You're still protected, I would think, because you built this series of layers on top. It's peeling the onion. And the core has no value for a given solution unless it's combined with what you invented later on. So really, you're protected as you innovate all along, even if the core loses value. Is that correct thinking, or that's totally wrong?
That's a very interesting question, Mark. There's a couple examples. We actually ran into that dynamic in the white LED space. So this is a very low-cost semiconductor light source that you see everywhere now in all kinds of lighting fixtures. So some of the earliest white LED patents are the ones that would expire immediately, because the research was done over 10 years ago.
Okay.
So you're left with improvements on that remain in force for another 20 years of their life, until eventually those expire as well. In the drug industry, the big pharma, the big drug companies are constantly thinking of ways to extend the life of their monopoly when their patent expires by doing these improvements that go beyond the basic drug molecule, on maybe delivery or mixtures of it, that give them more time. But eventually it's going to fall into the public domain.
And I would just make an observation that because solutions typically are a compilation of components of innovation, there is basically bartering and trading between owners of innovation for different solutions. And so you have an arsenal of ownership that is an asset portfolio that is of extreme value, protecting yourself later on. So there's a business component of this. In a scenario where you're being challenged on ownership of your entire solution, if you own part of it, that may be good enough to negotiate arrangements to own the entire thing, or rights to the entire thing, which give you access to market. Would that be accurate?
That's true. The startups run into that problem because often they only have a piece of a very complicated system, especially in the semiconductor area. So they may be acquired, or they may provide licensing revenue as a result of having a piece of a larger solution. We're seeing this now in the automotive area, in electric cars or telematic navigational systems, where a startup might have just a small piece of software that is integrated into a very complex car communication system. And so they need to partition the value. This is controversial because sometimes a little startup with a blocking patent on a large system, like a car, might have too much power. If they're able to get an injunction relief against the infringing company, they may shut down the shipment of a line of cars.
Correct.
So there's always interesting debate on what the right policy should be.
Let's end the discussion there. There's much more we can talk about in future videos. Thank you all very much.